Okay, welcome to the Smart Elections Election Protection Forum. Please stay with us. This is really going to be an evening to remember. We have some guests with us who are experts in their field and are willing to really talk to us in depth about something that we all care so much about, which is the true fairness of our elections, something that all of us here are really committed to. So we're really excited to have you with us. And let's just do some introductions. And for those of you who are a little new to us, we do visual descriptions for any of our friends who are watching who have visual impairments. So I'm going to start off. I'm Lulu Friesdat. I am the executive director and a co-founder of Smart Elections. I am a pale woman with a long braid today and some bangs, a brick wall behind me, and a tiger's eye necklace. Bennie, you're up.
All right, Bennie Smith, co-host. I am a Shelby County Election Commissioner Secretary and also technical advisor for Smart Elections. And I am a black male, low haircut, lots of monitors behind me, a tall chair, and a purple shirt that Lulu picked out for me about 40 minutes ago.
He wore a white shirt last time, and I feel like you could
This
do
is a
better,
light
Bennie.
shirt.
Is that a white shirt?
This is a light shirt.
Okay, but it's not a white shirt. Last time I thought you were going a little bit too much for the waiter look. I'm sorry. I know you could do
Whatever.
better. Okay.
David, I like your shirt.
Thank you, Benny. I like your shirt too. In
Thanks,
fact,
man. Lulu picked it.
I was planning for purple for tomorrow. Glad I didn't do that tonight.
You guys coordinated.
Right.
He's sharper dresser than I am, so I'm not sure I'd ever say that. But is that my cue?
Yes, you're on,
Or
David.
Miss Lerner? Okay, that's all right. For those of you that don't know me, I'm David Levine. I'm the Elections Integrity Fellow for the Alliance for Securing Democracy, which is a nonpartisan initiative that's housed within the German Marshall Fund of the United States. Before that, I was a state and local election official. I'm 5'5" on a good day. As my 4-year-old son Ben would say, Daddy's got a bald spot in back, and he's got gray to browning hair on top, what little he's got. And he's got a couple of pictures behind him with a white wall. Did I do okay on that?
That's great. We learned so
Okay.
much from these visual descriptions, even those of us who are watching. And our interpreter will give us a visual description also.
Hi, my name is Miriam Lerner, and I'm a white woman with gray brown hair, blue eyes, wearing a black shirt, earbuds, and behind me is my son's door because I'm interpreting from his house tonight because I was babysitting today. More than you needed to know. Thank you.
Okay, so I think we're ready to get rolling here. And the first thing to know is this is kind of going to be a two-part segment. So the first part, we did a pre-taped interview with Avery Davis Roberts from the Carter Center and David Levine, because Avery's schedule wouldn't permit her to be here this evening, but we really wanted to talk with her and get her insights. And so we're going to play that. I want you, while that's going, to go ahead and put your questions into the chat, into the comments area. We are lucky enough to have David Levine from the Alliance for Securing Democracy here with us live. He's going to do his best to answer those questions, and Bennie and I will jump into and answer questions if we feel like that's in our wheelhouse. So I'm really excited to play this video for you. I thought the interview was fascinating. We put some clips up on the social media sites. I promised Avery that I would get her on TikTok, but I didn't quite have time to do a TikTok. So after the forum, I will go ahead and put some clips up on TikTok. And I encourage you to follow us on TikTok. You know, TikTok is apparently where it's at. Bennie, are you on TikTok?
I'm not, but I need to get on there.
Okay, so let's and we put some captions on this. I am really excited to have with us two wonderful guests, academics and researchers and people who are committed to democracy. So we have Avery Davis Roberts from the Carter Center, and we'll put up the website for their organization, cartercenter.org/vote. Wonderful information there. And then we also have David Levine, who is from the Alliance for Securing Democracy, also an extremely organization with a very strong reputation, and a website there, securingdemocracy.org, if you want to learn more about their organizations. And if you want to follow them on Twitter, we've got @AveryElections, and we've got @David Allen Levine. So I'm going to be following them both on Twitter, and I hope you will too. You can follow me on Twitter @Lulu Friesdat. So we really want to get into this paper that you both co-authored. I was so excited reading it. I'm a little bit of a geek, but it's about the importance of nonpartisan election observation. And I think one of the first things that we want to do is just to talk about why that is important, especially in this environment, and what a serious threat we have right now to our democracy. And maybe is that something that really motivated you in writing this paper, the context? So do you want to just talk a little about that?
Lulu, I think both Avery and I have observed elections and worked in elections, not only in the United States, but around the world. And so we've had the opportunity to see countries at different stages of democracy. And one of the things that is clear from our experiences is that there's a place for people who observe the process and do so on behalf of candidates to make sure, of course, that the process is working in an equitable manner for them. But there's also an important place for those people who are making sure that the administration of an election is working simply in the name of democracy. And one of the reasons that we wrote this paper was because we recognize that the U.S. Is at a critical inflection point. Democracy is under assault here. We've seen an unprecedented exodus of election officials. We've seen mis and disinformation that nearly fueled the overturning of the 2020 election and continues to pose a threat. And we thought one small way to perhaps counter some of those efforts was to have greater nonpartisan observation. To try and make sure that those people who help ensure that our elections are sound and secure, simply for democracy's sake, have a real voice and are integral to the process.
Do you want to weigh in there, Avery? And I know we can even show a poll here. One of the things that you quoted in your paper was this. I just want to get this website pulled up. It was a PBS poll, and it showed that over 80% of Americans are actually concerned and believe that there is a serious threat to the future of our democracy. And I think that's a pretty startling figure. Do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, thanks, Lulu, and thanks also for inviting us to speak to you about this. I mean, I think that is a startling figure. I think, when we look back at polling data for the last 30, 40 years even, we've seen that there's been a decline in trust in general across institutions, decline in trust in judiciary, government officials. Overall, there's been a trust in institutions in the United States and a decline in trust in elections as well. But I do think that what is sort of different about where we are now is who is mistrusting of elections, the way that the sort of mistrust and concern about the state of democracy is spread across the population, regardless of political affiliation. There are real concerns about, the state of our democracy and the practices of democracy, so elections, for example. And I think that is unusual and not something that we have necessarily seen before and is a real concern.
And it's impacting election officials, certainly, in terms of the level of threats of violence against them. I think that is something that is would you say, unprecedented? I've read some of those quotes. They're profane, they're frightening, they're death threats that I think anybody would be sick to their stomach if they or their families received that type of threat.
I agree. And David, please, you should weigh in too with your sort of experience as an election official, but I think these are unprecedented times with regard to the threats and harassment that election officials are seeing. I will say also that I think this is pretty unique around the world. When I first started learning about the threats that election officials were facing, I reached out to colleagues who have worked on elections around the world for decades of experience working on elections, and asked, is this something that we've seen in other countries? Is this sort of an indicator of something we understand? And I universally got a response that this is really not something we've seen in other parts of the world. The only country that a colleague with literally 40 years of experience could sort of pull up as a comparator was the threats that election officials face in Afghanistan. This is a very, very unusual situation where election officials, as frontline workers of our democracy, are facing these kinds of threats.
But is this potentially civil war? Are we going to see violence at the polling locations? I know there was a book out about this and some very prominent articles. Thoughts?
Yeah, well, Avery may be able to speak more to the Civil War piece of it. I think certainly there's the opportunity that we could see, right, the further inciting of violence. We saw how in the run up to 2020 and in its aftermath, right, peaking with that insurrection on the U.S. Capitol on January 6th, right, we saw the effects of what mis and disinformation, election mis and disinformation, can have on the populace at large. And a point to something Avery was pointing at. I mean, I have seen and written about this kind of thing in places around the world. If you had asked me as an election official, even just a couple of years back, could I have fathomed something like what we saw on January 6th, 2021, I would have unequivocally told you no. Unfortunately, I think we're at a place where this continues to be a concern. I think violence, or the threat of violence, is a real issue. It helps explain why we hear increasingly about election officials trying to work hand in glove with law enforcement as they gear up for the November midterms.
It's very serious. And let's talk about how election observation can really be something that in a very meaningful way could address this, could help alleviate people's fears or people's concerns that somehow the elections are rigged. So this is not just something sort of frivolous on the side. This is a real direct action that people watching this forum, people, their families, their friends, their neighbors can get involved with and directly affect the safety and the security and the peace of our elections. And there's really kind of two categories of election observation. There's nonpartisan and there's partisan. And I think just to start off with, it would help us just to clearly understand that. What are some of the differences between partisan and nonpartisan election observation?
Thanks, Lulu. Yeah, so I mean, I think David said earlier that we definitely see that there's an important role for both kinds of observation in the context of building trust and confidence in election processes. Partisan election observation is really when candidates or parties or maybe even a ballot issue sort of have representatives in the polling place or observing other parts of the process, really trying to protect the interests of that candidate or party. They are there to make sure that the elections run smoothly so that their candidate or party really has as much of an advantage as possible without breaking the law. Nonpartisan observation, on the other hand, is really not about any partisan interest at all. It's really about understanding and observing and assessing the process to understand whether election administration processes and procedures are occurring according to the rules. It seems not very exciting, right? When you describe nonpartisan observation that way, it's like, oh yeah, great, rule following, great. But I think really what we see now, especially in contexts like ours, where there's such hyperpolarization, where that polarization and the toxicity of our political environment is sort of turning on the institution of our elections, that the election process itself needs champions. We need people to stand up and say, we support our election process. We're here to defend that election process. We're here to understand it. And defending it, by defending it, I mean also like saying the things that go really well about the process and the places where there can be improvement. It doesn't have to be, 100% sunshine and roses assessment of the election process, but really an honest assessment, but really being there for the institution of elections itself. David, what would you add?
No, I mean, I couldn't put it better myself, Avery. I think that, one of the reasons why we frankly need nonpartisan observation here is because a lot of the folks that do this kind of work, right, are providing in many cases a really important service by noting both what works and what doesn't, which can provide election officials, and I've been one of them, right, feedback so that they can continuously improve and do better. And I think, one of the things that unfortunately we saw in 2020 was a lot of folks in a bad faith way, right, castigating the process in a way that was unproductive and not helpful. And we still need to be in a place where we're not only countering those efforts, but continuously improving our process so that we can have our elections be as good as they can be. We have to be able to walk and chew gum at the same time.
Yeah, I love that. And I also just love the point that you're making about how maybe it isn't, as exciting to champion democracy, but I think people can get excited about it and have the perspective that the democracy is your candidate, fairness is your candidate, you're our country and the preservation of our process, that is your candidate, and that's the one that you're really championing. So I do think it's also really great just to talk about how in US elections, the observation has historically been done by partisan observers, people who are there to defend their candidate, to make sure their candidate wins. And that's really unusual in terms of the international scope of elections and election observation. The US is an outlier in that context, correct?
Yeah, for sure. The US is definitely an outlier in the way that we sort of bake partisanship into our election administration processes more broadly, but also in the context of election observation. There's this idea that partisanship, as long as you have multiple parties represented, it creates a sort of inbuilt checks and balances, which is definitely true. But there still is a place for nonpartisan observation, in part, just at the sort of very basic level, because some people don't really want to be affiliated with a political party. Some people want to be able to participate in public life, participate in politics in a way that isn't so tied to a specific political affiliation. And so just at the very basic level, that is one strong reason as an individual right that we need to have more nonpartisan observation.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of benefits also, right, to nonpartisan observation. I mean, groups such as all three of our groups, I believe, are nonpartisan organizations. We have, if there is nonpartisan observation, we have the ability to get involved in a more really tangible way.
That's exactly right, Lulu. I mean, one of the things I think that we saw throughout the 2020 election process, for example, in Georgia and other places where, we saw videotapes that distorted what in fact was happening with the election process, where people were told that they were doing something nefarious when in fact they weren't, which then subsequently led them, to get numerous death threats and other sorts of threats. And I think one of the things that experienced nonpartisan professionals can bring to the table is laying out, what's going on at the election process. One of the things I think that's really important is that election officials and poll workers are not perfect. And our elections are imperfect. But I think in a variety of respects, our elections are certainly legitimate. And I think there's an important conversation to be had to be able to establish how in fact the elections are being conducted, and if there are discrepancies, why they're occurring, so that we have a situation where people can understand the election process, understand why mistakes are made, and understand what can be done to help ensure that their votes are being cast and counted as they intended.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that you lay out in the paper that is so excellent is there's this kind of a ground rules that you're setting up. And there are ground rules on both sides. There's robust access. That's one thing you talk about. The election officials really have to allow for meaningful observation, which is something here in New York that we've struggled with. And we'll talk to you kind of about what our experience was, even like this past August when we tried to observe the primaries. Robust access wasn't anywhere near what we got. I was watching from behind a chain link fence, So there's that on the one side, and a transparency, and then there's also correct behavior from the observers, and that there's rules and guidelines about that. So I'd say talk a little bit about kind of, in order to have these benefits, there's certain ground rules that you're really laying down.
No, I think that's exactly right, Lulu. I mean, this sort of some of the ground rules that we talked about were not interfering in the process. That's rule number one for nonpartisan election observers. You're not really there. You're not there at all to interfere in the process. You're there to observe and to sort of be respectful of the process and not try and overstep. So that is absolutely critical for observers to be aware of that, and also to think about how you roll that into your training and things like that. But there are other sort of responsibilities as well. Some things to do with how you collect and use the information that you are collecting on election day. Like Do you have a systematic way of collecting that information? What are you doing with it? Are you using this as a conversation starter? Kind of getting back to David's point about, needing to sort of have processes in place for continuous improvement. Having this be a way to converse with election officials about the process and what you saw, and feeding that back into election administration practices is super critical, and I think a core responsibility of nonpartisan observers.
Do you want to weigh in there, David, in terms
You
of
know,
just kind of the benefits, and what are the ground rules in order to really get those benefits?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I think that, I think one of the things we talk about in this paper is making sure you're in a place so that you in fact are able to observe what's going on, so that you can make some informed judgments with regards to the process. I think, too often there's this sort of sense that we think about, I mean, there's not only the concern that if you have nonpartisan observers far away from the process, that they won't be able to observe, but there's actually the other side of that coin too, which is if you have nonpartisan observers so far away from the process, they may not be able to make actual informed judgments that are able to contribute, right, to assessing the process and determining how to do better. And I think, the other thing that we lay out in this process as well is making sure that jurisdictions that engage in nonpartisan election observation, there's a way in which you can be reaching out to your election official ahead of time to make sure that there's an understanding of what those ground rules are. Those ground rules may not be universally liked by election officials. They may not be universally liked by nonpartisan observers, but knowing what they are, answering questions about them ahead of time so that you're able to observe as much as you can on election day can be really, really beneficial. And I say that as someone who has been both an observer with organizations like the OSCE as well as a former election official. And I think the third thing that I think is sort of really important as well, touches on something with Avery, which is being mindful and sort of respectful of others. Avery used the word sort of interference. I mean, legislative efforts like Texas SB 1, right, do no favors for nonpartisan or election observation, right? Allowing observers to sort of be able to willy-nilly go all over the polling place and interfere in the efforts of election officials not only creates the possibility of interfering with the actual process, but it adds to this potential perception problem with regards to good nonpartisan observers. And that's the sort of sense that observers are in here to sort of get themselves involved in ways they shouldn't be with the process. And so I think it's really important that election observers and election officials are getting together, making sure there's a meeting of the minds as to how that process should go, making sure there's a way to be able to escalate if there are questions, so that, what happens on election day is as productive as possible.
Right. And I'm just going to share there's one of the great things about your paper is there's some great links in it. Wonderful resource, very dense and helpful publication. And this is one of the links that I found. And this actually has a whole a subset of links to election observation rules in many of the states. And so you can actually click on this here. This is at the, I think, National Conference of Legislators website. And it will take you to the rules for your state. It's so important, as David was saying, for everybody to be aware. You may not agree with the rules, but if those are the rules in your state, if those are the statutes, then you've absolutely got to know them ahead of time and plan for them. And I think one of the things that we've tried to do also is be in touch with election officials in advance. That's one of the things you talk about. We've developed a relationship now with the New York chair of the State Board of Elections, and he's been assisting us to kind of just navigate. Sometimes when we run into sort of headbutts with local election officials, he'll at least send an email and say, well, that is actually the statute, what they're trying to do. That's the statute. And so we've had, even though this, we ran into this situation in August, the New York City Board of Elections is not following the statute on a very important issue, actually. They're not looking at the results tapes that they are legally required to look at during the audit. They're not looking at them at all. And we're very concerned about it. And no matter what we said, they weren't going to look at it, and they referred us to their attorneys who said, we're just not doing it. But we did at least get that email from the State Board of Elections to them, establishing that that is the statute. And what is the best thing to do when you run into these problems and things aren't as you'd like or statutes aren't being followed? What are your suggestions?
I'll add a couple, and I'm sure Avery can jump on this. I think number one, it's to remind folks that you're on the same team, right? You're on team democracy. And I think that it's, you know, if folks aren't, you know, I'm obviously not privy to all of what's going on in New York, but if folks aren't following state statutes, the consequences for that are much more significant potentially than if in fact, right, you know, they choose to follow them. But I'll also add, you know, another point, which is I think it's really important to try and note what shared incentives there are. I mean, one of the things that I think is really important is we see election officials and poll workers, for example, that are now going to be thinking about not only how to administer the process potentially on election day, but to be mindful of bad actors who might either try to interfere with the process or cast doubt on its legitimacy. You know, one of the best allies to have on sort of establishing how, in fact, the election is being run are those folks who are observing the process on election day, who are reporting it as, in fact, it's occurring on the ground. Because so long as the election is being administered as it should be, right, you have a natural ally to be able to not only document what's going on, but to be able to put out, right, no, that you know, somebody said X about a voting machine. That's not, in fact, what occurred. Here's what, in fact, is occurring. And in our paper, we talk a little bit about the different kinds of things, both domestic and international, you know, observers can do in that regard.
Yeah, and I do think it's actually a good place to point out that some of the technology in our country is very dense, very complex, from the electronic poll books to the scanners, the voting machines, the ballot marking devices. Some states are still using direct record electronic machines. And that is one of the things that you point out in your paper, that a deep understanding of technology can really help in observing US elections because they are so technical. And I see you nodding there, Avery.
Yes, I agree.
Yeah, and that's one of the things that Smart Elections, actually, that's one of our areas of expertise. I'm an election security journalist, and we have a lot of election security advisors, and we have weekly meetings and forums where we really try to teach people about the technology. So that's a place where we really think that we can shine, and we encourage people to get involved in our organization at smartelections.us and learn, you know, more about that technology. I do want to really get into the challenges of getting people excited about nonpartisan observation. I know it's something that we've struggled with. People are so excited about their candidate and their candidate winning. What do you think?
No, I mean, I agree with you. I think that it's really hard to find exactly the right turn of phrase or I don't know, the right way to frame it so that people feel really excited about it. I think your point about sort of democracy or elections being your candidate is spot on. You know, when I reflect on, I think that there are lessons that we can learn from other countries in this regard, though, right? Because as you mentioned earlier, the United States is an outlier with regard to nonpartisan observation. Many other countries not only have rules and legal frameworks that really explicitly allow nonpartisan observation in a way that we don't see in quite the same way here, but they also have really strong, robust nonpartisan observation movements that have really been a movement of hundreds of thousands of people. So I think maybe one of the things that we need to do collectively as those who support nonpartisan observation is look at how some of these movements in other countries have kind of come about and how they've talked about their work as a way to capture not just the sort of intellectual side of election administration, but the hearts and minds of people who really want to support democracy and freedom of choice.
I love that. I love that. We need a movement, a nonpartisan election observation movement, maybe an acronym and a hashtag. So I think that's what we have time for. We're going to continue on with David live and have him answer questions from the audience. But this has just really been wonderful. And we definitely will be giving people the link to read the paper and explore more of it. Like I said, it's full of all kinds of great information. And we really just wanted to thank you both so much for being here with us today.
Thank you so much, Lulu.
Yeah, our pleasure.
Okay. Are we back? We're back live now, so you can. I saw
Where's
all those.
David? He's got to get on the hot seat.
We're going to do a little bit of station identification to let people know about smart
Okay.
elections and how they can get involved in this whole process and with us. And then we'll bring a number of other guests. We'll bring David back, as well as a couple candidates from the New York August primary that I was talking about, where we really had quite a difficult time doing the observation. And I think it's great to just get input on that. So we are Smart Elections. If you want to know more about us, smartelections.us. And especially if you're interested in this topic, we have created a form, a Google form, yay, for you to fill out, just to let us know that you're interested in this and how we can stay in touch with you. So I'm going to go ahead and put that link into the chat. And that's just to, you're not committing to anything by filling out that form. That's just saying, hey, I'm interested in this, and I'd like to stay in touch and learn more. So fill out our form to learn more. And what we also hope to do, there are so many groups that are doing nonpartisan observation. Bennie is working with a number of them, and Smart Elections is in touch with quite a few. I'm hesitant to even start shouting out their names because I know we'll forget some people, but there's really a lot of nonpartisan observation that's happening from small, very committed groups that have been at this for decades. And so one of the things that we're hoping to do is create a hub where you can learn more about what's going on and where you might feel most comfortable plugging in. We definitely encourage you, one way or another, to jump in there and try to get involved. As you can hear, even big think tanks like the Carter Center and the Alliance for Securing Democracy are saying this kind of small, very local work is really where the action is. And I love this term that's come up. It's called plumbing. There was a New York Times video about how everything, that's happening is deep down in the plumbing of the elections. And for those of us who have been dealing with the plumbing for decades, we're like, yes, thank you. You finally noticed.
Right.
No one ever notices the plumbing until something goes wrong. So we here at Smart Elections and some of the other groups have really been working on this for decades, and we hope that you're going to jump in. Maybe you already are very involved. We hope that you're going to continue that commitment. So let's just tell you a little bit more about Smart Elections. If you want to reach us, you can email us at contact@smartelections.us. And we love to hear from you, especially if there's things either that you loved about the forum. Please do send an email about what you learned or how positive your experience was, or throw something in the comments about what you liked about the forum. That really helps us get the word out to people about the work that we're doing. This is the paper that we're talking about this evening from the Carter Center and the Alliance for Securing Democracy. And I put that link into the comments, but I will put that in one more time just so people can get a hold of that. And there I see Dale Axelrod asking for that. There's your paper, Dale, right there. And then why don't you want to talk about how people can follow us on social media, Bennie?
Yeah, you got to put it up though.
I will.
We're
I will.
at smart_elections. I don't know what our TikTok is, but that's pretty cool.
It's just
that we're on
Smart
TikTok
Elections.
now. Okay, Smart Elections. And then also you can look at our YouTube. I would encourage everybody to look at the prior versions, the prior episodes. We've had a lot of people to come onto the show. I had to speak in Palm Beach. I was at a panel there, and I think we had the 60 Minutes, former 60 Minutes host Lara Logan was the moderator there, and I had to have a lot of talks with people aside on the side after I spoke, and I had to give them a lot of content because I think I gave them greetings from somewhere in the upper middle of the rabbit hole. I was giving them greetings from being down at the bottom of the rabbit hole. So there are a lot of people coming online, and they're now paying attention, but they have to have somewhere to go. So these episodes are really good primers of what to look for in election and election integrity.
Love that. And I just put that link into the chat. And then Emily is reminding us that our forum is about poll watching, which in some states is different from observing. And I think it's going to be really kind of difficult to get language that works in every state because
Yes,
all the
Canvas
states
in
are
some
different.
places.
Right, but she's absolutely right that
Yeah.
nonpartisan election observation is the more broad general term, and we should probably change our form. So thanks so much for that tip, Emily. So basically, we're giving you like our social media links. We're also on Facebook, we're on Instagram, and Bennie mentioned YouTube, because we want you to follow us. We want you to retweet. It really helps get the message out. You are our PR machine. When you get our emails about the forums, please forward them to your networks and let people know. If you like the forum tonight, please do send it to your friends and say, hey, you can watch this. It's at the same links. And of course, you can always donate to us if you are so inspired. We certainly can use support, financial support. It helps us to keep doing our work.
Especially when you write really big checks that are tax deductible.
Big checks, small checks, all the checks help. And you can do online as well as writing a check. And I'm going to go ahead and put that link into the comments. So this is for donations, which we very much welcome. You can do it right now, right this minute. It takes just about 5 minutes, and we're non-profit, so you do get a tax deduction for that donation. Okay, so I think, oh, and then the other thing that we should cover is just, we're having the forums once a month now. That's a better pace for us when we're not trying to do so much. So it's the 4th Tuesday of the month, so put it in your calendar. And the next one is going to be on October 25th. And we hope that you're going to join us then. We're going to continue to talk about the elections and how to be involved with them. So we'll put that up at the end of the evening, also October 25th, same time, 4 p.m. Pacific time, 7 p.m. There's our banner for that, 7 p.m. Eastern time for the forum on October 25th. And you sign up for that at the same spot. It's always the same Mobilize spot where you can sign up. Did I forget anything, Bennie?
Nope. I think that's it.
Okay, so we had a ton of questions in the chat, which I thought were really great. We just have such a well-informed audience, and I'm just going to bring the whole crew on now, and we're going to bring David back. Hey, David, and we're going to add 2 candidates. It's going to is Paperboy ready? Paperboy, I don't see his. Yeah, there you are. You have any light on you, Paperboy? Are you totally dark?
Yeah, I'm in the.
All right, so
So-
Paperboy, Lulu is in the bushes. Are you hiding out, or you good?
Okay, that's the last episode. If you didn't check out our last episode from September, you totally should check it out.
Lulu was running from the helicopters. They had.
Let me see if I can get some. Is that
Oh,
better
yeah.
light?
Yeah, there you
Yeah,
go.
that's great.
I can
That's
do that.
great.
Yeah.
Okay, so for our 2 new people that we're adding into the mix now, we have Paperboy Prince, who was a candidate in the New York 7th U.S. congressional race in August. Paperboy, can you say hello and give a brief visual description of yourself?
Hi, Paper. Yeah, one love. I'm Paperboy Prince. Paperboy Love Prince. I'm a artist and activist and candidate for New York's 7th congressional district. Visual description: I am a beautiful person, and I really don't even know how to describe myself. I'm so happy to be here, though. I have some pinkish hair, light pink hair, some brown skin, and a camouflage shirt.
Nice. That's the best visual description I've ever heard. We're introducing you to Mike Hanno, also a candidate in the New York August primary. He was running for Congress in New York's 13th district. Mike, say hello and a visual description.
Hello. I'm middle-aged and 5'10", 205 pounds. I'm overweight. Need to start running again. But I had a hip replacement like 7 months ago, so we'll see how that goes. That's all.
We learned so much from these visual descriptions, way more than just visual. It's amazing.
Those Mr. Glasses, Michael.
Very, very useful. So we had some really good comments in the chat, and a lot of them had to do with kind of a very strong feeling from the audience about what happens when when the election officials aren't playing by the rules. And we're going to give you some examples of that happened here in the August primary. But I think almost any of these comments will start to, really address that situation. I think Kelly Lane's comment probably touched on it the most. I'm just looking. Kelly, said here, what is our recourse when election officials are not following statutes regarding observation or keeping meeting minutes of board of election meetings? And there she's actually specifically referring to an incident that I'm familiar with in North Carolina. But I want to just talk, so this is happening on a regular basis. Many of the people that we're working with when they're doing observation are encountering this. And we'd like to get your response to this, David, like what, you think is really the appropriate course of action. But I just want to get a little bit of the anecdote more in detail. So I think, Mike, maybe you might be a good person to start off with in regard to kind of what your experience was trying to observe this audit in the New York August primary. The official date of the primary was August 23rd, and of course there was early voting before that. And the candidates in New York do have the right to observe the audit. In New York, as far as we know, there is not nonpartisan observation. The way that we do our nonpartisan observation is that we work with a candidate. So we were working with Paperboy Prince in order to observe in as nonpartisan way as possible. But the official rules in New York are for candidates. So Mike, you went and observed the audit. And did it give you confidence in the results?
It did the exact opposite. I mean, when I became a candidate, I was not aware of a whole lot of fraud going on, and a bunch of people from my community who've been involved in politics, because I'm new at this, they reached out and told me there's a lot of crazy stuff going on. And that was actually one of the factors that made me decide not to run a campaign this time, because I realized that even if I was somehow able to win by a couple of percentage points in a low turnout election, if this was a primary that was not at the usual time because of a court case, I knew that it would be very low turnout. And I figured if what they were saying was true, there's no way that I would be the winner, even if I did win by a little bit. So I did want to see what's going on behind the scenes, though. And the day afterwards, I looked up the rules and the New York City Board of Elections schedule of things. And I went the next day to the Manhattan Board of Elections, and you have to wait downstairs. Someone from upstairs has to come and get you. They kept us waiting a good long time. And then a couple of people came down and said, "Oh, we're already done for the day. We didn't do anything with the scanners yet because they're not all here. They're still being brought in. We just opened up some absentee ballots and we already finished with that." Okay, great. So they said they were going to start the next day. I showed up the next day, and I had spoken with Lulu the night before. And I had looked up the New York State election law. It said that they were supposed to be getting those official results from the tabulated results tapes, which I think are these paper tapes printed out from the scanners. And the law specifically says that a candidate or the candidate's representative are allowed to observe this and to make a record of it. And then there's also all these provisions for if there's any discrepancies between the results from the electronic data things and the results tapes, the things that you can do to address that. So these people were not happy to have me there. They kept me waiting in corners. I was not allowed to even take out my cell phone and look at it. I noticed that no cameras, security cameras, in this entire facility. And that struck me as strange. And we're just hearing on the news recently about, camera footage of what happened in Georgia. I would have to imagine that a place where the voting machines are and the ballots are and people are counting votes, that and a casino are the places where everything should be on camera 24/7, and yet there's no cameras there. But
so Mike, I just want,
anyway,
because we just have limited time, so I just want you to specifically talk about, you asked for what the statutes require, which is that they look at the results taped and compare those to the electronic results, to the electronic media. And were they doing that? Were they looking at the results tapes?
When I asked to see the tapes, they said, no, those tapes are locked away. They're in these yellow bags that are locked up, and we won't open those until after the election is certified.
And so
Well, what do
were
they look
you
like? After a while,
allowed, I just want to ask you, were you allowed to look at the
go ahead.
results tapes as you were, as the statute says that you're
No,
supposed to? Were you
I
allowed
was
to
not
look?
allowed to look at them. Supposedly, nobody is allowed to look at them after election night. They're put into these locked bags with the initial data sticks that have been read. And all that's being done is somebody walks into this room with a pouch full of the memory sticks that have supposedly just been taken out of the scanners. Of course, I don't get to witness that. This guy just comes in with a bunch of memory sticks, and there's pairs of people, supposedly one Democrat, Republican. They're taking these data sticks, inserting it into a computer, and it says data read. The data has been entered. You don't get to see the data. You don't get to see any numbers of votes, or anything. And they told me that if the machine, for some reason, is not able to read the data, then they take the ballots out of that scanner and scan them again, or hand count them, whatever. But there's nothing to observe. There's no way that any discrepancy could ever be found, because you're not allowed to see any of the numbers of the data. It is crazy. If somebody was given free rein to design a system that would enable fraud, I think that this would be up there with the top choices. I walked out. There was nothing to see, and
Right.
you
So
could
you
see
didn't,
there's something really wrong.
it didn't give you confidence.
It did the
And
exact opposite.
I can just confirm, Mike was in Manhattan, I was in Brooklyn, and the process in Brooklyn was the same. They take the memory stick. You're not allowed to go anywhere near the computers. You can't even really see what's on the screen. But they explained to me, the staff puts the memory stick into the computer. The computer says stick red. You don't see any of the votes or anything. And then they take it out, and then they put the next stick in. It says stick red. They take it out, put the next one in, stick red. And then the computer exports that information, and they email it to the other bureau of the Board of Elections. And after this information has been electronically transferred again, then they compare it to, some other, to the media that they had on election night. So David, I'm going to put you in the hot seat now. So, and these are the types of concerns that people had throughout the questions. And we don't have time to go into all of these questions, but many of the questions in the chat are about what are you doing when things just really aren't going the way that you expect them to go.
Sure. I appreciate the opportunity to answer, and I appreciate the comments from Mr. Hanno. I think a couple of things are really important. So I'll take your last question first. This may not be this kind of thing that sort of is completely satisfying, but I think it's important to document. I think it's important to document, and to be able to have witnesses who are there, and to be able to put out, I think Smart Elections does this and others, but be able to, put together, write reports on the experiences you've had, being able to lay out what you've experienced and went through, having others affirming that, and then asking, as I've done as an observer, right? In many cases, asking election officials to comment, note where they agree or disagree and why, and being able to put that out. And that I'm the first to admit that doesn't always move the needle, but it moves the needle more often than one might think. I think the other thing that I think is important to note more broadly, Lulu, that I think is touched on is I think there are three things that are, and I know you know this, and it's a bit of an oversimplification, but I think it's worth noting. There are three things that are really important for election security. One is, of course, the method in which you vote, and I know Smart Elections is a lot on that, and the importance of having a paper-based system. The second thing is having strong chain of custody, and the third thing, of course, is having a way of being able to validate the results. And a number of the concerns that were raised touched on the chain of custody piece of this, and the ability to be able to see the process. And so, I certainly hear Mr. Hanno, and he's not the first. He certainly won't be the last in terms of having some of the frustrations that he espoused. Obviously, as you know, I can't speak directly to New York situation, but I do think that it's important, following an election, to try and be able to put together as best as one understands what they experienced, document it, ask for people to comment. If they don't comment, be able to put that out to try and move the needle. One of the reasons we've seen the United States have greater and greater over time, still not perfect, but more nonpartisan observation of elections, right? Not what you're sort of describing goes on in New York, at least hitching your wagon onto a candidate, is because people have begun to sort of see the benefits of nonpartisan observation, some of which we've talked about right in the paper. And so, no, I'm sorry you've had those frustrations. But I think for me, it's about being able to document, affirm, publish, get feedback, and then work to try and as best one can to improve the system for the better. And obviously for folks like me who've been on both sides of the coin, I've been able to be part of situations where I've often worked alongside of either observers or election officials for positive change, but I'm not naive enough to think that that's how it'll be everywhere.
I really appreciate those. I think those are great suggestions, and we are going to be putting out a report and taking in comments from Mike and also from Paperboy Prince, who I think will let him speak for himself, but also I think had some concerns. And I'm wondering if that's the kind of thing where we could even be working more collaboratively with your organization, the Alliance for Securing Democracy, and the Carter Center. We could have you review our reports, and maybe it's the kind of thing where you could either also send a separate letter saying, if in fact this is true, this would be concerning to us, or try to work more collaboratively with groups that maybe would help give a little more weight when these situations come up. I think many of us feel sort of a little bit overpowered by the density of the machines that we're dealing with and sort of their longstanding traditions of really having a closed interface to observers.
Yeah. No, you had raised that, I think, earlier today, Lulu, and I think certainly there's openness. I mean, I'm the first to admit that part of the reason why this paper came together nicely is that we at the Alliance for Securing Democracy really focus on autocratic actors, right? An issue that was on the Russia, China's, and Iran's of the world. We now look at both foreign and domestic autocratic actors, and that was the expertise we brought. The Carter Center, of course, brings this nonpartisan observation piece, right, globally, and of course are now bringing it closer to home. In fact, inside the United States here for November. But I think that, I think that that's something that certainly, I think it's important that there continues to be sort of best practices shared. I mean, one thing that's worth noting, of course, is that there are places that do after action reports on a regular basis, looking at how their election went, what went well and what could go better, right? The Washington, D.C. Board of Elections, whether you agree with how they do stuff, don't agree, or fall somewhere in between, covers a whole host of facets of the election process, and often, at least when I was there, but I think even after, would take feedback in part from the public and from observers as they thought about how to improve their processes. And just to give you an example, one of the things that was an issue, at least in DC, was that sometimes you got these really small polling places, and a lot of people wanted to be observers. And how could you do that in a way so that people weren't on top of each other with all the other observers and all the other workers and all the other voters? And so, again, whether you agree or disagree, DC was able to work out a system where there's basically an equitable rotation of the observers so that people can get in and get a clear shot for a period of time and then be able to go outside and see if some of what goes outside and then go back in. Perfect? Absolutely not. But it was the kind of compromise that I think helped some folks who maybe before that hadn't felt like they'd been able to have more of a view into what went on with the process. And so there's an example of jurisdictions doing after action reports that in part were informed by the work of folks outside of their board of election. Again, not a panacea by any stretch, but hopefully, a helpful tip or two.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a great idea. And I'm going to get Paperboy in here. So Paperboy, what was your experience in terms of being a candidate? Did you have confidence in the results? How did you feel about the audit process?
Hi. Thank you. First, I want to say a big thank you to Smart Elections and for all of your help in guiding us through this process and with some of the forms and helping educate some of the people on our team. So that was awesome. I had felt sketchy about the results from when I had run before. I ran for Congress in 2020, which there was a lot of turnout in that election. And then I ran for mayor in New York City in 2021. And that's when we first connected. And every year, when you watch the numbers, and I also have a lot of friends and maybe a better word is acquaintances that are also candidates as well. And a lot of folks have just seen numbers that are really weird, places where they knock doors, things that just often don't make sense and connect. Um, yeah, for me, I felt very unsettled often about the results. And, in fact, since the election, I'm pretty active in the community, and I walk around and I meet a lot of folks that work the polls. And, they tell me, hey, where we were at, everyone was voting for you. We were talking to folks, we were telling them to vote for you. And I told them, hey, you're not supposed to do that. But even knowing that there were folks in there that were that were doing that for me kind of opened my eyes as to how comfortable it is for folks to petition for a certain candidate inside of a polling place. And, but yeah, they would tell me, hey, a lot of folks would tell us they were voting for you and stuff like that. And in our election, because like Mike mentioned, there was this court case made this be the only election happening in our neighborhood. In a lot of neighborhoods, this was the only election happening. So a lot of folks were just going off of what they heard from people. And yeah, the workers, the poll workers had a really clear vision of who was voting for who, because it was just, this was the only election on the ballot in a lot of those places. There was extremely low turnout just from what folks say, and then what it seems like at the end of the day often seems off. Again, the hardest part of this is like what many of you have mentioned, is that because you can't view kind of end to end all of the numbers and data, it's hard to prove. And if you're not keeping up with all of the timelines in an orderly fashion, it's even harder to prove.
I'm going to stop you there, Paperboy, just because we're going to be out of time here. But I think we're getting a sense of what the experience was like for you, and it's really kind of you to just be here and share that with us. Bennie, I'm going to put you in the hot seat now, because I know that you kind of have worked both sides of this coin. You've been an election official and also somebody who's actually discovered discrepancies in the election results. How are you feeling about kind of the balance of what you've heard tonight? You've heard from our guests about the efforts that people are undertaking to really try to shore up this process and give people confidence, and and really try to make sure that things are on the up and up. And then you saw like all the comments in the chat, it was almost overwhelmingly negative, and our candidates actually had a pretty negative experience as well. How are we kind of to process and take all of this away in terms of what are our efforts really best focused on, and how are you feeling about it?
Yeah, I think to see the level of engagement now is encouraging. I wouldn't say we're at a tipping point, but I do think we're at a crisis point in the country where the mood is 50-50 nearly every time there's an election, where democracy has been relegated to the statistics of a coin toss, where half of the country doesn't believe the outcome. So that means we need something different. And I think transparency is really what we got to get to. Every description I heard just reeked the chain of custody. I think David hit the nail on the head. It's something that and when we started this forum, I started drilling into the need for chain of custody. When you hear these thumb drives being moved around, somebody's signature's got to be in the receiving end, and somebody's signature has to be in the tabulation end, and then there's somebody's signature that has to be in the storage end. So I would want to see what the chain of custody rules are around moving this equipment around. Michael's experience, Paperboy's experience, I thought I heard the internet. Like, was he saying that the tabulator, after the thumb drives were connected, that they emailed the returns? I don't think that should be possible. I think that's like an absolute violation of EAC guidelines. Well, you can violate the EAC guidelines, but yeah, that one's a bad one. That was a really bad one.
They're emailing them. I mean, it's not the original returns, but those are,
Word?
yeah, I went over
That
the
means the
process with them.
tabulator is connected to the internet.
Well, this is not necessarily. This is the
Yeah.
computer that's doing the report on the media sticks that come in on the voting machines, and then that
Okay.
computer
So then
that computer generates
I got it.
a report, and then
Then I
they
was
email that
inarticulate.
report.
I was inarticulate. So what's happening is the central tabulator is being transferred to thumb drives, and they're taking those thumb drives and they're transferring it to another computer, which is technically leaving it as air gapped, unless they turn around and take the same thumb drive back to the other
I
computer.
don't think they're reusing the thumb drives.
Yeah,
I
so
think they've got
you
that
would
down.
definitely need a chain of custody for how you're keeping the thumb drives. Because I did this as an election official, where our county, they were taking the thumb drives and they had like some pliers and they were tearing up the thumb drives. I'm like, you can't do that. That I don't know what's on that. You have to inventory that. So that was something that I had to correct as election commissioner. So I would definitely want to see the chain of custody for that. And in regard to the comments, it just we need transparency. Like there has to be so much transparency. And I think Mike Cornell just sent me a picture where I got a picture on my phone where they're like in Ukraine and they are casting their ballot in a clear box, and it's getting to the point where you're gonna have to look at something that is going to give some assurance. I'm gonna put it on my camera so people can see it. It's gonna be zoom.
It's blurry.
But this is a lady dropping her ballot in Ukraine and it says breaking news, but it's a clear box. Transparency is going to be the solve for this. And again, like Civil War, it's rough, and that was one of the reasons why I went to speak at this forum that I went to, because it needs to be nonpartisan. I think that's something that we strive to do really well. I think we do it really well here. I should compliment you, Lulu. We are really, I think both me and you got in a lot of trouble when the 2020 election happened, because we kept talking and saying the same thing, and people was like, wait a minute, there's no reason to talk anymore. I was like, yes, there is a reason, because there are a lot of people who don't believe the outcome. And I think Lynn Bernstein is another one of those people that stepped out. And Audit USA was a part of the Arizona audit. I think that more of that has to happen. I definitely like what David is doing. This is an idea whose time has come, and most of us resident experts have to step up. Matter of fact, I was in an election commission meeting yesterday, and a lady, she came and she was hammering. There is a new movement where they're looking for these cast vote records, and it's I was at the forum where they were passing it out. They had this whole curriculum, and I think Emily's on. I sent her the workbook. It was a concise workbook, and they're asking for cast vote records. And there was a lady that got up in our commission meeting, and she was like, "I've asked for these cast vote records, and you won't send them to me." And I was like, "We got DREs. There are no cast vote records."
Wow.
So I had to explain to her that, the technology changes per county, and we have 95 counties, and we're not on that technology yet. But she would not have believed it if it would have come from anyone else. It would have had to come from someone that they follow and believe. So that there is a vacuum that is being filled with a lot of charlatans or a lot of people who are doing a lot of guesswork. So we have to try to consolidate these resources and get some messaging around what is believable and what is not. And I think I said earlier that I was bringing greetings to people who I believe were at the upper top of the rabbit hole. There are a lot of people that want to know this stuff now, and we have to be here for them to give them that information.
Awesome. So I think that's what we have time for. And what I would suggest, maybe we had so many really excellent comments in the chat, very detailed things.
They're good ones.
And I wonder if maybe we could do a Twitter storm and a dialogue with you. And I know Avery is on Twitter, even though she said she doesn't use it. But David, perhaps we could put these questions one by one up on Twitter. We can find an assigned time and, all sort of meet on Twitter and have you give you a chance to respond. Because some of the questions were really fascinating. What's going on in North Carolina, or what's going on, in other states, in Florida. And I think people would love to get your input on them.
Yeah.
What do you think about that for sort of moving forward with the process with all of this really creative input that we've got?
Sure. I mean, some of these questions, obviously, right, either my colleague Avery may be able to better answer, or I may not have answers to them, but I'm certainly happy to sort of go back and forth, and my Twitter handle's there for people to be able to reach out to. So I'm happy to, be able to talk about some of that. And, I would add too, though, if you're in a place that doesn't technically have nonpartisan observation, I do think that that's really important. One of the things that I would add just real briefly here is we've talked a lot about where election officials can do better. I do think it's important, particularly in light of 2020, to be able to actually sort of note about the role that nonpartisan observers can now play in helping deal with folks who may actually be trying to interfere with the administration of elections, right? When poll workers are receiving trainings on how to ignore election rules, I think it's really important. I just put out a report earlier this morning on how to potentially deal with rogue poll workers, something that I don't think I could have ever fathomed having to write before. And there's a real place for nonpartisan observers to play in that process. Helping identify and make sure that those who are doing well continue to do well, and those who may not be, that there's accountability there too.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm putting the link to your latest paper. It's on vetting poll workers into the chat. There was a really great quote in there that I think maybe we could go out on. Let me see if I have it. It was a quote from CISA, actually. CISA's gotten a lot better. And let me just, I thought there were, because one of the things that you're concentrating on in that new paper is the fear of insider manipulation or some insider access that can be problematic. And so that was something that I think many of us have been really afraid of for a long time, that there could be an insider problem. And this is a quote from, we can go out on this, a quote from CISA that David quotes in his latest paper, a call to establish robust standard operating procedures, managing physical and digital access control, deploying zero trust security principles, love that phrase, zero trust security principles, and implementing chain of custody processes. So great selection in terms of the resources that you're using there, and totally encourage everybody to read that paper and to continue to follow our guests in their very meaningful work. And best of luck to our candidates. Thanks for their courage and their dedication in running for office and sharing their experience with us. Remember that our next forum is going to be on October 25th, and I hope that you will sign up for it today. And thank you all so much for being here. It's really been a pleasure. Good night.
Thank you.
Good night.